Out. Cool. The recording is in progress. We are now actually recording something. So everything we say will be on the record. So we have to be very, very cautious, I suppose.
Sure.
Well, welcome, Amy. It's great to have you here. Um,
Thank you,
I,
Adam.
how did we, I guess we started connecting because you reached out. Is that how
I
we
did.
initially got into conversation? Yeah,
I
cool.
did.
So thanks for doing that.
You're welcome.
I thought a good starting place might be just for you to share a little bit about like your journey. So obviously you coach, you're very committed to like, if I remember correctly, like mediation and bringing coaching into the legal profession. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So what's like, how did that all come into being, as succinct as you can make it?
Sure.
Uh-huh.
The brief story is that in my own journey, I did it all wrong. I did not give myself permission to tell the truth for many, many years till I was about 45 years old. I had never had boundaries modeled for me. And so I was pretty lost when I had some big conflicts in my own life.
Mm,
And I had worked with parents for years and years as an educator and found that coaching was a much more engaging way to connect parenting skills with real life.
mm,
And when I was going through my separation and divorce, I was asked to take my parent education to a new level, working with other folks that were in the court system. And I just jumped at that chance because I was so eager to learn myself. So
mm.
I created a course. And once people found out that I was willing to work with people in conflict, I got so many referrals. And I started getting referrals from attorneys whose clients were really hurting.
Mm.
And I offered myself up as a service for folks who were facing a lot of decisions and feeling very incompetent and unclear with what they needed in order to know they were making the right decision. So
Hmm.
it turned out that coaching was an awesome intervention for them because, of course, in coaching, we can ask all those questions that help uncover the story of what's really going on for the person so that they can understand themselves better, be more aware of what they really need, and come up with action steps that are going to help them get from point A to point B. And so
So,
it's really evolved from there. And I started taking on, higher and higher conflict cases till where I am today.
oh, cool. So let's go back. Like you said, I can't remember the exact wording. So it's something to the effect you were never telling the truth up until
I
about 45.
wasn't.
Is that right?
I
How
grew up
come?
without telling the truth. I was too
What
scared.
led to that?
Yeah. So I grew up in a household where my parents bickered. And
Uh-huh.
then there were these very predictable patterns of how my dad would get really loud and then my mom would shut down and cry for a couple of days.
Yeah.
And there was just no room for me to have my own experience with that because I did not want to contribute to the dysfunction and the tension in the household. So I
Mm,
took on the role of this peacemaker that just tried to help everybody and thought, well, I'm just going to be fine so
I
that
see.
nobody has to have anything else on their plate other than what they're already dealing with.
So you learned to keep it all internalized, basically. Not everything's good over here. Let's talk more about you. Would that be accurate?
Yes, except I wasn't aware of it at all. I
Right. Mostly
genuinely
unconscious.
thought that's all there was just trying to stay at the surface. And it really didn't occur to me until I had some conflicts with some friends and then really big conflicts with my first husband that it was obvious that there was a big gap between how I felt and what I said. But it took me literally years to start to just say what was going on with me so that I could start to become a decision maker in my own life. So it
So
really was very unconscious.
uh-huh. Yeah, well, so I'm super interested in
Yeah.
that. Like, so you'd learned to pull it in, to
Mhm.
kind of, and of course, like you said, it's not conscious. We start to see the world
At
through
a
the lens of
day
what we're
level.
playing. Hmm.
Mhm.
So what was your experience as you were sort of playing this game out in your life?
Mhm. Literally, my heart hurt. I
Okay.
I had pains in my body, mostly in my back and shoulders.
You were conscious of that?
I was very aware that I was in physical pain, but I didn't know to relate it to my emotional energy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was there like I would imagine if you're always sort of if I was always setting myself aside and
Mhm.
being there for other people, would that be an accurate way to describe kind of how you were being?
Completely. I really did not give myself any credit for developing my own ways of getting my needs met.
Uh-huh, got it. And so I would imagine if I was doing that, and I'm not so much interested in what I would be doing, but more you. But like for me, it would be sort of, I'd probably feel a degree, like a low grade degree of resentment, or maybe I would imagine like exhaustion. And I'm curious, like, what was your daily kind of experience, notwithstanding the physical pain, but like, how
Sure.
did you just experience life from that place?
Yes. So I really didn't have an independent identity. I was a codependent. I relied on other people that I deemed older and wiser
Mm,
to make decisions for me, and felt like that would be the easiest and most likely way to make a good decision was to rely on other people. And
mm.
so I lived as a dependent literally for 45 years. So
How was
letting
that?
other people make all the big decisions and me going along just to try to accommodate, be agreeable, thinking that that would be the shortest route to staying in relationship.
Uh-huh.
And I can't speak for my first husband, but my guess is he he didn't experience love for me. He didn't experience a connection for me. I wasn't there. I wasn't showing up.
Mm.
So I wasn't taking any personal risks to say something, knowing it might cause a rift in our connection, but knowing now, boy, it's that risk taking that builds intimacy.
Yeah. So that's what you were doing. What you were
That's what I
doing was
Mhm.
finding, you know, sort of aligning with people that were strong decision makers or that I guess would put themselves into the space so then you wouldn't have to,
Mhm.
all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious, and I wonder if you're aware of it, of like the underlying experience. Like, how were you left feeling given that's what you were doing? Does that make sense?
Very sad and very scared. I was
Got it.
really scared because being a dependent, if anything happens to your attachment, you know, whoever you're attached to, whoever you're dependent on, it's just very scary, the thought of losing that person.
Uh-huh.
Right. So I lived in a lot of fear that I
Mm.
would lose my husband, which I eventually did.
But
Yeah.
because you left or he left
He
or
left. Yeah. He left.
I see.
And what was particularly of note in my situation was the women in my life that modeled boundaries were so different than I was. They had a boldness, a brashness, if I can say a bitchiness
Mm.
about them that was so unattractive to me. It looked very rude. It looked very self-oriented. It almost looked theatrical. So I
Hmm.
just didn't have any models of women that I saw as strong, intelligent women that had a way of setting boundaries and just speaking up for their own needs without being jerks. And that
Hmm.
really became my signature, Adam, was recognizing that I could start telling the truth and still be kind and generous and warm to people. And so it's just really grown from there so that my boundary setting now is just a way of claiming what you're willing and able to do without being in any way dismissive or rude to anybody else.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's where you arrived at, and I want to talk about that, but I really
Mhm.
want to slow down the journey
Okay.
so that people can, because not everyone, you know, I often
Yeah.
find and maybe you find this too, a lot of times people, we've got a good story about how things were rough in the past, and then we have an amazing story of triumph, you know, how things are now. But where people find themselves is often somewhere in the midpoint.
Somewhere in the middle.
Uh-huh. And they're kind of like, you know, so I first even want to acknowledge you for sharing, you know, it was sad and scary because I think a lot of people might really be able to like, oh yeah, I often feel that. And maybe that is a function of the fact that I'm, you know, quelling myself censoring what's there for me.
Mm,
So, so you, the thing you said that really caught me was you didn't have role models, so to speak,
mm,
of like women or even people. It sounds like they could
right.
honor sovereignty or boundaries in a way that felt healthy. I would imagine the people you saw might have, if what you were doing was, let's see, you said your dad was the one that had all the, he would get
He
angry and
had
then your
all the
mom would kind of,
power and all the volume and made very
uh-huh,
quick reactions.
right. So I would
Mhm.
imagine these women you saw were more in alignment with that kind of energetic quality. Would that be accurate?
Definitely more, somewhat aligned.
Uh-huh.
Um, but he was very predictable. And I
Yes.
found that a lot of women in my circle were a little less predictable. I was very confused a lot. Like, where are you
Mm,
going with this? Right. So my
mm,
dad was very easy to read. You knew what he expected.
yeah.
And that wasn't always true with some of the other folks in my life that carried that domineering energy.
I
I was
see.
confused a lot. I did not understand why I felt so bad all the time. I didn't understand. I really thought that just being a nice, considerate person ought to be enough.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I love that term, enough, because it's
Mhm.
so interesting. I guess in some ways I could imagine it is enough until we want something more.
Well, it's not enough to really allow us to form an authentic identity, right?
Uh-huh.
So being kind and generous and friendly and warm it was for me, and so often is a way to be socially acceptable
Mm-hmm.
rather than genuine. And in
Mm-hmm.
order to become genuine, we have to I had to give myself permission to experience a more complete or more full range of emotion.
Uh-huh.
And
What
I had only really cultivated the friendly, warm side of myself. And it really took a lot of work for me to even give myself permission to be angry or
mm,
disappointed in someone or to really wrestle with some negative emotions.
uh-huh. What
Mhm.
what did it take to, learn to integrate those parts of yourself to kind of bring love to the parts that it sounds like you'd kind of shut in a closet?
Well, it took disaster for me,
Uh-huh.
absolute
A breakdown.
disaster, scandalous divorce, a lot of fear. Literally, my house burned down. Literally and figuratively, my house burned down.
Wow.
It took it took devastation. And, I literally was curled up in a ball on my bathroom floor until my friends were like, Amy, you're taking a shower today. Let's go.
Mm-hmm.
And I just didn't see the signs. I didn't trust myself earlier. And I actually, Adam was so skilled at just demonstrating socially acceptable behaviors that most people probably thought I was good. They probably thought I was good to go. When inside,
Mm-hmm.
I was very, very just in knots.
Mm-hmm. Your
Mhm.
house burned down, like as
Literally.
part of the divorce? Is that like part of what led to?
Yeah, it was just my son and I living there after his dad and sisters had moved out. His sisters were in college and his dad had moved out. And one night I woke up in the middle of the night and the house was completely filled with smoke. And
Wow.
thankfully we got out. Um, but the entire house took 14 months to rebuild.
Holy moly.
So it was interesting, Adam, because I knew I needed help. And one quality I had is I did receive. I let people support me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because I had literally prayed like, how am I going to make this house my own after the divorce? My husband had literally grown up in that house. Now it was mine. And the next thing I knew it, I had, hundreds of people from the insurance company to the contractors to the all the different people that were helping us with the house come in and supported me through creating a life in a house of my own. So that was when I really started receiving help, and I started getting coaching. And I had a very dear coach who was willing to challenge me and point out the gap between how I felt and what I said and did. And so
Mm,
she helped me really learn about alignment between thoughts, feelings, and actions. She was
mm-hmm.
good. She was good because she was not afraid to ask questions that she knew would be hard questions for me. And I was
Mm-hmm.
open. I was open because I didn't want to stay where I was.
Yeah, I imagine like,
Mm.
well, first of all, I love that, like, you pray for how can I make this house my own? And the answer is, oh, burn it to the ground. When you have no
Sure.
choice but to make it,
I
you
know
know?
next time any request is just add the word safely at the
Yeah,
end.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like you get the genie with the three wishes.
Yeah.
There's all these qualifying words, and
Yeah.
then you've got a
Can we
legal
just do
contract
it
for the genie to
safely?
sign.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But it
So,
really was then that I started asking myself the question of what's true for me
mm-hmm.
rather than what should I do or what would be the
Uh-huh.
socially acceptable thing to do or what would my parents want me to do or what would my husband want me to do, and just
Yeah.
started asking myself, giving myself a right to an opinion to my life.
Yeah. A lot of my people, because I'm one of these people too, we learned early on the context we developed is, what do I need to do? And then it sort of becomes
Mhm.
like, once you do what you need to do, then you can do what you want to do.
Yeah.
And as you play that game more and more, you get better and better at figuring out what needs to be done. And as you age, you discover there's an infinite amount of stuff that needs to be done. And so over time, there's no, the voice of what I want to do, that muscle atrophies. And then eventually we're really, really reliable to get done what needs to be done. But you ask us what we want, and we're like, I don't know.
Don't
I know
even
I need to do
know.
this for my kids, or, whatever.
Mhm. Mhm.
So was this when you began working with a coach? Was this sort of like the
Yes.
initial, aha? Oh, there was one
Mhm.
other thing I was going to speak to, which is, it sounds like you kind of reached a point where in my lineage of work, we say before we have a breakthrough, there has to be a breakdown.
Mhm.
Our fantasy, human fantasy about breakthroughs is sort of like, things will change without me having to really do that much
Right.
different. I'll just find the trick or the technique. And then, but usually the old patterns, the old ways of being have to fully fall apart. And, in recovery work, they call this rock bottom. In
Mm.
ontological work, my lineage of work, we call this, really bankrupting the old ways of being. And it sounds like at around 45, you kind of fully bankrupted this.
Fully bankrupted. All my
Uh-huh.
fears played out.
Yeah.
And one thread that it was consistent through my life from early on until now is really knowing, having a knowing that there were trustworthy people and that life works out. And
Mm,
so I remember being very confused because it didn't look like my life was working, but I still had a sense that there was good in the world, good in me, good people. And that helped me a lot
mm,
to stay open to receiving goodness because nothing short of miracles started happening, just people that I met. And, I ended up going on a spiritual retreat sort of as a just sort of a last minute thought. And
where'd you go?
so when my children were going to go on a trip with their dad for the first time, I thought I can't stay here alone.
Hmm.
And so I just booked a flight to the least expensive destination in Florida. I like
Mm,
Florida. So I booked a flight to Tampa, Florida.
hmm.
And then literally later that day, an email came in my inbox, invited me to a spiritual retreat. And guess where it was? The
Hmm.
nearest
I love it.
airport was Tampa
Yeah.
during that week, right?
Yeah.
So
Incredible.
that's not a coincidence. That
Uh-huh.
was, I just call that my first miracle.
Yeah.
And so just going there and meeting people where I could start to express just some teeny bits of my truth and
Beginning to practice something
ex
new.
practice with people that
Hmm.
didn't know me and that knew nothing of my history. And it was really fun to get some feedback where people could tell me when they knew I was being authentic or not.
Mm.
And it
Uh,
was really fun. Yeah, it was really fun. So it was very obvious early on that that was going to be my journey, was learning how to quit looking good and
Mhm.
actually just be me.
I love as I deepen in my own work, I find I put quotes around coincidence more and more.
Mm,
And of course, like everything in life, it's really our frame. We can hold something as, hey, it's a coincidence and it's totally fine. We can hold it like this is a gift from
mhm.
spirit. We can hold it like the space blueberry muffin shot a blueberry and it landed on my head and
Right,
that made it, it's
right.
all whatever we
Yeah, whatever
choose.
you want to call it.
Yeah, but hopefully we choose an empowering belief. And
Right,
so for me,
right.
I see more and more quotation marks as I talk about coincidence. Um,
Yeah, every
so
day.
a lot of people I notice there's a desire when we're practicing something new like this, especially in the face of having learned an old way of being for
Mhm,
45 years,
mhm.
there's like a hope, sort of like, well, I'll just start practicing the new thing and it'll go hunky dory and everything will shift,
Mm,
which is a little bit like going to the gym and thinking like, yeah, I'm going to start lifting these weights. I'm going to be super empowered and it's going to be fun. But of course, there's like a slog period. There's that point where you're on the bench and you're lifting, your muscles are shaking, you feel
right.
stupid. And so I'm curious, as you're starting to practice this, were there ever moments that you can think of or remember where you put your truth out there and it wasn't received like, yay, thank you for your authenticity? Maybe it was received a little way that you were worried about or a little concerned about or anything like that that happened.
It actually shook up all my relationships. And one of
Mm,
the main ways I saw it play out in a challenging way was with my dad, because my mom
mm.
actually died during this time.
Oof, that's
And
another thing on the table for you.
well,
Yeah.
so almost right away, I started getting some amazing messages from her. And I just really felt like she was happy to support me from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
But I started speaking differently to my dad. And so some of the things that he had maybe demanded of me, that I was no longer willing to just, I just was no longer willing to comply the way he expected me to.
Mm,
And so I just remember being willing to tell him, maybe a different answer than he was expecting from me. And eventually, after probably 3 years after my husband left, I started being able to speak up with some boundaries with him. And, he was willing to stay married and just live separately and have other relationships. And
your dad was?
no, my husband.
Your husband, gotcha. Yeah.
And so I finally, said to him, I didn't think this was a real marriage and thought divorce might be a better fit for
Mm-hmm.
what we were experiencing. But
Expressing a truth of yours.
exactly. But
Yeah.
really, all my friends were making comments and kind of wondering, like, what happened to you?
Mm,
And so it was pretty abrupt. It was pretty abrupt. And I needed to take care of myself financially. So I was pretty bold in starting a business out of necessity.
uh-huh.
And I knew that I loved receiving coaching, and I had had such a good experience with the start of developing a coaching career, that I really dove in and put almost all of my brain power into my work and
Mm,
into creating a company and to start acquiring clients and working with them and kind of learning with them. And that helped me so much because I saw myself as so capable
mm.
on that level, even when I was still curious about who I was becoming. But you're asking a great question, like what were the ups and downs like?
Yeah. Like how did your dad respond when you started, you
Mm.
know, showing up differently? Basically
He
breaking the
yelled.
kind of implied agreement.
Yeah, he yelled.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So got angry.
He got angry.
Uh-huh.
Mhm. Made demands really loudly.
Did the relationship get a little worse before it shifted in a different way, or how did that play out?
I really didn't have any patience for a transition with him.
Mm,
I jumped right into, I do things for him that he needs me to do, but I don't necessarily spend time with him just to enjoy each other's company. And I
mm,
haven't since. Yeah,
mm. Wow. So really shifted.
big shift, big shift.
Yeah.
And I would say I really made so many connections through work that I could start those relationships brand new. And
Hmm.
I'm a natural leader. So, and I think I have a lot of pretty natural confidence. So I didn't have a hard time creating a whole new life for myself. I definitely still cried a lot. I definitely still had that feeling inside of desperate need for security.
Hmm.
And so while it didn't show that much on the outside, and I had a pretty nice, um, I've had a really nice run in my career, I definitely had probably a good 5, 7 years before I felt congruent,
Mm-hmm.
where I had confidence on the inside to match the confidence that I displayed on the outside.
Yeah.
It was a long journey. Yeah.
A couple thoughts. The first one is you mentioned like being, a natural leader, and I can see the essence of leader as part of what you bring into the space. And one of the things I think is so cool about just the way we evolve is that we create strategies growing up that have us actually show up as the opposite of who we truly are. And then that becomes
Mm.
part of our path through life, is to like often continually at greater and greater levels step
Mm.
beyond that. So I love that someone who is leader by her very nature learned to keep herself quiet and to follow others. Often the greatest leaders are the greatest followers, waiting to step into that because it's safer. And,
Adam,
you
I
know,
never put that together.
it's
I
so funny, isn't it?
love the way you just said that.
Yeah.
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 Because I
It's
was the
really
youngest in my
amazing.
family and never even knew I was smart until I was in my 20s because I compared myself to my siblings that I thought were smarter than I was.
Right. And it's so
Never put
cool
that
because
together.
you'd see their brilliance because it's part of, it's funny. We see our virtue in others, and then we wish, if only I could be like them completely, so we're just too close to ourselves.
And then here
The
we
other
are.
thing that really that you were sharing about your dad reminded me of was like when I first got into this work. And what happened was I got some really potent reflection, and what
Hmm.
was revealed to me or offered to me was like, hey, Adam, the package looks great. You're smart, charming, handsome, witty, well educated, blah 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 blah. I keep adding to this list as time goes on.
It sounds so good.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love this part of the story.
Yeah.
And then they're like, but you're like a perfect polished suit of armor. There's no way in, there's no access,
Uh,
and it's kind of cool to look at, but there's no capacity for vulnerability, intimacy,
mm,
authenticity. And so we get tired. We can't make an impact. And so we go to the
um,
people that we can. And so that really struck me. Not sort of like, what a neat idea. Maybe I should put some thought to that, but more like, oh my God, I feel seen for the first time. And I can see the thing I've been tripping over all my life. Wow. And so I came home from this
mm,
potent weekend, which was the first of a year
wow.
long training I was in. And I started trying to practice differently with my wife, being vulnerable, sharing how I was just afraid, scared, sad. And she hated it. And she hated
You
it
didn't know what to do?
that, and I was violating the uneasy balance, I like to call it, in
Um,
our relationship, because all of us come into a relationship in a way that makes sense. And for
mm,
us, that was, I never had emotions. I had it all. I was stoic, and it was all handled, and there's nothing to see here. And then she had the
wow.
emotional content for two of us. So in that, we were kind
Wow.
of, balanced to a degree.
You
And now
threw
I'm
that
coming
off.
home. Yeah, and I come home and I'm doing something different. And of course, that's going to be really confronting and concerning
You
for her.
broke
So
the rules.
exactly. Yeah, I broke the implied rules. And so it's always, I really acknowledge you and appreciate you sharing about how it went with your dad, because I think it's really important for all of us to recognize transformation costs something. It's not free. We have to go through a fire, so to speak, purifying
Mm,
fire.
literally, I did. You're right. And not to be too dramatic here, but the cost of not making those sacrifices is your life. It
Yes.
costs you your life to not take on the challenge of becoming more you.
Yeah, that's so true.
Mm.
And the thing, that's remarkable at human beings is how adaptive we are. We can adapt to not being more of ourselves, And as we do so, we find really good justifications and validations and like, hey, you know what? Life's not that bad. And
But our
there's
hearts
a,
aren't open. Your
that's
heart
right.
can't be open unless you're telling the truth.
And we feel that kind of low grade energy you were sharing about, like for
Mm.
you, it was sort of like sad and scared, not
All
probably
the
not
time.
acute, but just
Mhm.
always there. For me, it was sort of one of like always feeling resentful and disappointed. I made my
Oh,
life about not being disappointed
what a
and
burden.
totally. Yeah. But when we can kind of, it's like when you learn to live with an injury. You're just like, yeah, my shoulder just hurts and I learned to be with it. And it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. We can let
Because
go of
there's
that.
always this low grade negative pulling you
Yeah.
away from your joy.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So
Um,
thanks for sharing that because that's so helpful for people, I think, to really get like, oh, there's a cost to
yeah.
this. Yeah.
Well, I still struggle, if that's the right word, ponder. Sometimes it
Hmm,
feels like a
hmm.
struggle, but it's more of a ponder. Um, Adam, my dad is turning 100 this year
Wow.
in a month.
Incredible.
And I keep thinking, is there another chapter? Like, is there
Hmm.
another transition? Because every time I see him, I ask myself, who is the authentic Amy here?
Mm.
How can I be with my dad in an authentic way that is also very supportive of this very dear old man who has grown enormously in his life?
Yeah.
And we've talked about it. He's talked about how he had no idea the impact he had when he yelled.
Mm. Mm.
And
Beautiful.
I just asked myself a lot, like, what's possible now, right? I still have time with him. He's probably going to stay alive until the Cleveland Guardians win the World Series. And I just think, is there another piece of this?
So
And I don't know.
beautiful.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I
such
just
a great
ask.
question to be
I
looking
just
at.
love, I love considering myself a radical truth teller now. So I just love that question. What is true right now?
Hmm.
Right. And when I think about, I'm going to have dinner with him in a few days and just how do I want to wrap my mind around that night? What do I want that night to be about for us?
So
Yeah.
powerful to ask a question like that, like who do I want to be? How do I want to
Yeah.
create this as
What's
opposed
true?
to here's how he is or this is the way
Oh,
things
right.
are,
This
really
is
locks
all
us.
right. I talk a lot with clients about rewriting their story, right? Because
Hmm.
definitely nothing changes until we change our story.
Yes.
And shifting from talking about what was done to us to talking about our experience and
Hmm.
what we've been through, and not referencing, I call them the ghosts, not referring to all these other people who aren't in the room. Just talk
Yes.
about you, right? And I like to think of our empowerment story as always evolving. We're always
Hmm.
learning something new. That's what empowerment is that we trust growth. We no longer think we have to know everything or we've got it figured out.
Yeah.
And it's just really fun to see how that plays out when we continue to ask the question.
Yeah, cool. Well, so you said like boundaries is a big part of your kind of
Mhm.
work, and that word's come up a few times.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about like I find that's a concept that many people throw around, and it's got many, many different ways of relating to it. So maybe you can start into this part of the conversation by sharing a little bit about what that means for you and how you see it play
Sure.
out.
Sure.
Yeah.
It really came out of my own experience. I can literally remember the situation where I realized that I could have boundaries that were meaningful, sustainable, firm, and not be a bitch and
Hmm.
be myself. And the way it worked for me was to be able to say what I was willing and able to do rather than trying to tell someone else what to do, because of course that never works. No
Yeah.
one wants to be told what to do. No one wants to feel controlled, right? And so, matter of fact, I was just working with a client before this call, and she is learning to set boundaries with her soon to be ex-husband.
Mm.
And we were talking about this model of just, I'm asking her questions. What would you be willing to do? What are you able to do? And as soon as she started talking about, here's how I'd like to see my time spent, or here's how I think our money should be spent. She had a completely different demeanor than when she
Mm,
was talking about all the ways he was trying to impose how she spent her time and money.
right.
And so we just played off of that energy of when you step into what you are willing and able to do, you can claim it without crossing that line into undermining someone else's dignity or
Uh-huh.
undermining someone else's choices. So a very simple, non, not an intense example. My son would say, and I'm actually, this is actually referring to someone else's story, but
Mm,
the son would say, you have to pick me up from work at 5 o'clock. And this mom would leave work early to get to her son's work by 5 o'clock when he got off. And she finally realized she could say, oh, I get off work at 5 o'clock. I can be there by
mhm.
20 after. That's a boundary.
Yes.
And she's not saying, you have no right to tell me what time I need to be there. She just needs to say, oh, I'm happy to pick you up. I can be there at 20 after.
Hmm.
So that's a boundary.
Yeah.
She uses her voice. She's considering her options. She's looking at what she can influence. She's making choices. I use the voice, VOICE, to, what's the vision you're trying to create? What are your options, influence choices, and what's going to leave you feeling empowered? In
Mm,
every situation that requires boundaries, can be stated in terms of what we are willing and able to do. So somebody
hmm.
saying you owe me $100, we don't need to argue. We just might say, well, the way I see it, um, I would be willing to pay you 35. So it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be an argument. It doesn't have to be a fight. It doesn't have to be defensiveness. It can just be stating what you are willing and able to do. And then if people want to go into it more, you can say, would you like to hear how I arrived at that number?
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
again, we're not imposing, you should see it my way, right? And so the extreme of this that I'm seeing in my world right now is when people talk about politics and
Before we go there,
yeah,
because I do want to go there, but
yeah.
like there's a couple, like the way of being we're describing, I would call like sovereignty. Well,
Mm,
I'm sovereign and I honor your sovereignty. And
I love that word.
me too. It's very potent. And
Mhm.
one of the things I notice where people get slipped up with boundaries is we two things. One is we want to establish a boundary, and then we have an expectation that now you, Amy, will honor my boundary. And that's not really how it works.
Not how it
I
works.
have to honor my boundary. So if I say, look, it's not okay for me to have people yell at me, and then you start to yell at me, my job is to, great, Amy's going to yell at me. I'm
Yeah,
going to leave the room because it's not
exactly.
okay for me. And then that puts the sovereignty back in my hands. I get to be the one at power, and I don't have to make you wrong for it. It's very easy.
And I would love to state that as I'd love to have this conversation. When
Yeah.
you're done yelling, I'll be in the hall
Yeah, that's right.
or
Yeah.
I'll check in with you again tomorrow.
And we can free ourselves from making someone else wrong or
Yeah. And we
that's
can
no.
still be clear that we care. We want to have the information. We're just not willing to be yelled at. I
Now, of
love
course,
that.
that's a bit of an evolved state because our I think my experience is our defaults to make people wrong, make ourselves wrong, make others wrong. But that's okay. It's a practice.
We can
The
still do that, notice it and flip it in a matter of seconds.
Yeah, it's always
Mhm.
available. And
Mhm.
the other thing I notice with boundaries is that part of where we can struggle is we don't want there to be consequences. We often want our choices to be without a particular set of consequences. And the truth is that establishing boundaries, just like you established with your father, just like, on some level I established with my wife, there are consequences. They don't have to be the be all and end all.
Right.
But what I find can be helpful, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is to get clear. It's kind of the first V of your voice acronym, to get clear
Mhm.
on what's our vision, like what for am I
What do you
doing
want?
this, as opposed to get caught up in what might happen if I do this.
What
Hmm.
is it that we really want to create here?
Yeah.
Mm.
What are we going towards rather than what might it?
I
It's
love
sort
how
of
you said that.
very easy for us as humans to get caught on like the cost. This is, if you have coaching clients, it's often the number one thing that people are like, before we go anywhere, what will this cost? And usually the more powerful question is, before we go anywhere, what do you want in your life? Then we can look at what it might require. Not because that gets us hired, but because that gives an example of what
What's
allows us to move
true?
forward. Yeah. Go
It's
ahead.
the
What were you going to say?
reality of
Yes.
change. Yeah,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
sure. I use this every day. Change requires a vision.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it's part of the chaos. So for us to try on anything new without a destination in mind of how we want to feel, of how we want to experience it, it's just more turmoil. And
Hmm.
so many people know what they don't want, and
Yes.
we can often use what they don't want, use that contrast to help
Yep.
them determine what they do want. And once people are clear on what they do want, then we can back into the behaviors that are going to get them there.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So good.
So you were going to completely derail our conversation and bring
I
it over to
know. May
politics.
I?
Let's do it. Yes,
Yeah.
please do.
Well, it was a funny story, but my husband asked me recently, I have a new husband now.
Uh-huh.
And he asked me recently, could we not talk about politics? And I said, no, I think it's great to talk about politics, but I will absolutely commit to not fussing with you about it.
Hmm.
Right? I like hearing what you think about issues, and I commit that if we get to a point where it doesn't feel good, if we're not having a good experience with the conversation, sure, we can stop there. And so the point was, he wanted to make sure that our home did not become a hotbed of wrestling over these issues. There's so many issues with, that are
Yes.
so multidimensional. And a lot of people that struggle with politics attach the experience they're having with an issue to the person. They judge the person on their position on that issue rather than seeing it as exactly what it is, a position on an issue that
Hmm.
makes sense for their experience. So I love a good debate. I enjoy good political debates. Matter of fact, I have an organization this weekend that we literally meet with folks of other persuasions and
Mm.
practice having conversations where we can talk about our disagreements with enough curiosity, enough thoughtfulness, enough attention to sovereignty, where we literally are there to learn and to practice being with people with whom we disagree on an issue. And I think it's a great exercise for self-compassion, for self-management, and to keep asking ourselves that question, what is my vision here? Why do I want to engage in this conversation with this person?
Hmm.
And sometimes we find out that we don't. And then
Hmm.
we set the boundary to say, hey, I could talk about X or Y, but tonight is not a good night for me to talk about Z. And that's a
Yeah.
boundary.
Yeah.
So it's just that visioning helps us determine where we need a boundary and where it's just a free for all to enjoy the conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I often get present to, there's a few parts to this, but the first is that as humans, we're not particularly adept at feeling our, like being present to our own heartbreak. And
Mm.
then what it surfaces as, we pile stuff on top of it. What it surfaces as is often fear and anger, righteous anger. And
Righteous anger.
uh-huh.
Mm.
And righteousness is very safe. And all I mean by righteousness is getting entrenched into a position there's a right way to be or thing to
Yeah.
do and a wrong way to be or thing to do. And a lot of the political I don't want to really say discourse, more I'm going to say like the
Rhetoric.
conflict.
Mhm.
Yeah, really in my when I really sit down with people, and coaching is a beautiful gift for this because it teaches
Mhm.
us to just get curious and to set aside our own position and just like, well, what's the deal over there? And when I
Right.
when I
How
look
did
far
you come
enough,
to that position?
mm-hmm,
Yeah,
because everything makes sense. If we're willing to dig far enough, at some point it all clicks
it
together.
makes sense.
Yeah, but the trouble with being righteously angry is that we stop. having any curiosity about that, and we become fixated on they're wrong, I'm right, they're an idiot, and then the divide increases. And I
Right.
find as we get curious enough, usually on some level there's a lot of heartbreak and a lot of fear
Mm.
underneath a lot of this stuff. And what heartbreak and fear want is simple answers, very linear, like
Mm.
solve this, and then we get stuck.
We have sometimes we have such a limited capacity for uncertainty.
Yes,
I
less and
find
less
that
each as time goes on, I think.
I find that self-compassion is a real key, because if we can notice that self-righteous superiority, if you will, we can know that that means there's a hurt in there somewhere.
Yes.
And if we can be compassionate to the part of us that feels a need to be superior or to be right, it can soften it so quickly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The challenge, of course, is that when
Yeah.
these things we sound very
Mm.
smart saying them
Right
as we
now.
are. Yeah. And the people listening are probably very smart and probably feel like,
Sure.
yeah, that totally makes sense. But of course, the challenge,
Yeah.
certainly for me and what I witness in other people, is in the moment, it never occurs like a hurt. In
Right.
fact, it occurs like, hell no, there's nothing
All up
hurt.
here.
That's right. It's in her head
Mhm.
and it makes perfect rational sense. No, the problem is
Mhm.
that these dumb, and then blah, 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 blah. And so it's really, I think you're right on the money there, like self-compassion. And the challenge there is to discover the places where we're not compassionate with ourselves. And that doesn't always look as like we think it might.
My personal habit, and the habit that I encourage with folks in really high conflict situations, is to practice when you're not in the heat of the situation. So, for example, I have
Yeah.
5 check-ins minimum during the day linked to other habits throughout the day, where I'm going to check in, kind of just see how I'm doing, see what my needs are, see how I'm feeling in relation to some conversations that I've had. And so that gives us a little private time to practice remembering self-compassion, practice remembering that certain feelings actually come out of hurt.
Hmm.
And if we practice enough when we're not in the heat of the moment, we have better access to it. I know you
Yes.
know this, but I just love saying it out loud, that we want to have access when we are in a really negative headspace. We want to have access to those habits, even if it's a breath, planting our feet on the floor, rubbing our hands together, taking a sip of our tea, whatever habit we need that just reminds us that there's something else going on.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. It's like doing a fire drill, when there's not a
Perfect.
fire, right?
Perfect.
That's why we do it is, and
Mhm.
I often,
Practice.
it's funny. I love that you brought up the word practice because for me, that's such an important topic.
Mm.
Because our context, typically, as people with busy lives in this crazy busy time we live in, is not to come to stuff from a context of practice. It's to come from a context of get it done. Because then it's off my list and then I can go back to like maybe some sanity.
Mm.
And practice is like ongoing. You don't do it right or wrong. There's no winning, there's no finishing. You just sit down and practice.
Notice, notice, notice.
That's right. Yeah. And what I
Mm.
love, is sometimes these practices, I think probably the same thing you're doing. I invite people to work at a gradient. And so
Mm.
sometimes people have a challenge with choice and they're really stuck like, should I do this or should I do that? And of course, the strategy there is to find an external answer. And, if I interview enough people, they'll tell me the thing and then the right answer will
No,
appear.
no, no,
No, it
no.
won't, because all you're
The
doing is delaying
opposite, right?
choice.
Just get
That's
more
right.
confused.
Yeah, you're just getting better and better at not making a choice, ironically. And so the real thing is to make a choice and be the consequences. And when we get people to play at a lower gradient, sometimes it can be as simple as like, it's always funny because I'll ask people like, what's it like when you sit down in a restaurant? People with this particular struggle.
Mhm.
And they're like, oh, it's a nightmare. Like I sit down, I ask my friends what they're going to have. I look at the menu, I look at what other people are eating. I ask them what, and it's just like, okay, just choose something on the menu and then
Right.
close the menu and order it. And it's amazing, to your point,
Yeah.
how much that opens up for them. Just something that seems so silly because they're
It taps
practicing at a
into the
lower gradient.
story.
That's right. Yeah. And
Mhm.
what I love is how we're being in one place is how we're being everywhere. So if we practice in one place, we're
Mm.
practicing everywhere. It's really
Mhm.
miraculous.
Nothing short of miraculous. I have a question for you, Adam. When you use the
Please.
word consequences, is that the same in your mind as saying the cause and effect?
Yes. Yeah.
Con-
Go ahead, please.
Consequences feels a little negative to me for
Yeah.
some reason. And I'm just curious if it's the same thing as just looking at the effect, because I love words. I love playing
Yes.
with different words and understanding what they mean to different people. And
Yeah,
I
I've
was
been
curious if it was the same for you.
I've been looking sort of for a different word because of what
Hmm.
you just said. We have a context for that word, which is consequences equals bad. Um, and so yeah, like effect or impact is probably even a better word. There's going to be an impact to any choice that we make, and we will relate. Impact is simply impact, but we will have a relationship to particular impacts, like this is good and this is bad, and ultimately all there is to do is to make a choice and then
Mhm.
to sort of notice, how do I feel,
Mhm.
how's this going, what's the
Mhm.
impact that this had, and then that teaches us how to make it the next choice, and then the next one, the next one.
I love it. As if it's a linear learning, right?
Yes. Yeah. The metaphor that I'll share, and then I'm curious if you have a metaphor for
Mm.
transformation or for this kind of work we both operate in. The metaphor I really love is one of riding a bike. And
Mm.
what a lot of us as humans want is, we learned how to ride a bike when we were young and open to a lot. But then as adults, we get to this place where we're like seeking out experts and like, tell me how to ride a bike. And then we ask our friends, what do you do to ride a bike? And we're engaged in really working hard to avoid having to fall off a bike. And what we want to do is learn how to ride a bike without ever having to fall off of it. And that's not the way we learned. The way we
That
learned
is
is,
so well said. We're
it's
so
hilarious.
willing to learn how to ride a bike as long as we don't have to fall.
Yes, yeah. And that's what,
Yeah.
and falling off the bike is the learning. That's the breakdown, and the breakthrough is when we get past that. And so I find that really salient. I'm curious if you have any metaphors that you use to describe kind of this process
Mm.
people are in.
Well, I typically use whatever I know about that person, right?
Hmm.
I would say one little thing I would change about the bike is that we learn by learning that we can get back up after we fall.
Beautiful.
And we start to see that there's actually a rebound, that
Yes.
the fail, the fall, if you will, is actually I don't know, I use the word opportunity because it's maybe a little bit overused in my world.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really a glimpse at what the rebound's going to look like. And once we trust ourselves that we can handle, that we are going to rebound, then the fall doesn't seem so bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the teachers I worked with, I've got a lot of lineages I've practiced in. One was
Uh,
indigenous shamanism, and my teacher talked about the archetype of the fool, the tarot card with the fool who's
mm,
walking off the cliff with a dog pulling it back. And
mm,
um, she told me, I was sharing with her, like, oh, I feel really stupid or foolish or whatever. And she said, yeah, the fool is the archetype of wisdom, because the fool knowingly stands on the rug with the full awareness it's going to be pulled out from under his feet, because the fool understands that's the only way to gain wisdom, is we have to do that. And in doing that, we develop trust. That's how trust
mhm,
comes about, because we learn, oh, I bruised myself a bit, but I'm back and I can walk further. And so I love what you're pointing to, which is, every time we fall off that bike and get back on, we learn, oh, it's not that bad. And then we can go a little bit further, and then we can go a little bit faster, and then we can turn a little bit more. And,
mm.
it builds on itself. It's
Yeah.
a very virtuous cycle.
It brings up a thought that I address with many of my clients that are learning to override the alarm bells in their nervous system
Mm.
when they're really getting grabbed in their nervous system by a relationship, maybe a high conflict um, colleague or boss or co-parent. And they often ask me the question, how long is it going to be before I quit getting so triggered or quit getting so grabbed? And
Uh-huh.
I say to them, well, I've got some bad news and I have some good news. I say the bad news, if you consider bad, is you probably will continue to have that reaction because that's your brain's job, is
Yep.
to set off the alarm. But
Yes.
the good news is it's going to, at some point, only take a matter of seconds before you can say, thank you for that alarm. I'm good. I'm safe. And the alarm can go away. And so really
Hmm.
they're learning to shorten the time it takes to re-engage a sensation of safety
Yes.
after the alarm goes off. And so
Yeah.
it's like, how long does it take you to just jump back up and get back on the horse, get back up on the bike? Because you know you can,
Yeah.
rather than lying there thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to die here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so great. I love that you said it that way. And there's like I find the journey anytime we're leaning into a new area is at first we get triggered or our alarm bell
Mm.
goes off. And then the next thing that's funny is we become resistant to the idea that we're triggered. And that's the hurdle at
Because
first,
we're too good to get triggered.
exactly, or it's wrong, or I shouldn't, or I've been
Right.
meditating, I shouldn't have, so
Right.
that's the first hurdle. Then the next one is to like have a lot of grace and compassion with ourselves. Like, oh, it's okay, Adam, that you're triggered, and
You're
that's not
supposed
wrong.
to. We thank our
Uh-huh. That's
brain. Thank you for that alarm so I could have a quick
yes.
check and see if I'm safe.
Yeah. And then the next thing that happens is we start to stop making it significant that we're triggered, and then we
Ah,
choose
well
back
said.
in. And then each of those windows becomes shorter and shorter. But the very best of us at the very best of times still have resistance, still have, because we're humans.
We
And
are
thank
still in the
goodness.
human body.
That's right. Yeah. Thank
Um,
goodness we get that. The thing I tell people is
yeah.
often like, it's going to take longer than you want it to,
Mhm.
and it's going to happen sooner than you think it will, which
I
is
love
kind of,
that. Kind of
paradoxical.
put both ends out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I personally, Adam, I'm a really big risk taker. And I
Oh
think
dear.
that's just personality because
Mm,
I don't see that in my family of origin. I really see it as just a personality thing. Maybe it comes from being so trusting of the people on whom I was dependent. But I have a sticker on my computer that says, what if I fail? And then it says, oh, my darling, what if you fly?
ah, yes. Yeah. I love that
And
one.
that is just so attractive to me, the thought of flying, that
Yeah.
I'm pretty risky. I'm pretty willing to fail if it means I might get to fly.
Well, here's
That's
here's my take on that, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And then we'll start to wind down after this.
Mhm.
But you have the essence of leader, and I would say the embodiment of that, like to lead is to walk into the field without any of the grass pushed down. It's to go into
Mm.
the unknown. That's where leadership lies. Doing what everyone's already doing better is fine and has plenty of value, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not leader. So the being of leader is to do that. What I
Mm.
find is from we all learn growing up to become afraid by the world around us showing up the way
Mm.
the world, and we're children, we have to, that's important. And what some people learn
Yeah.
from leader is kind of what you learned for the first 45 years of your life, is to like hide that away,
Rest.
not to do that. So
Mhm.
it would make sense to me that you'd have people in your family that are kind of almost the opposite of that. It's almost a perfect pairing. I really love that. And I can completely see, of
So
course,
good.
you would lean into risks and take that stuff that's
Mhm.
part of the being you bring into the space, into the conversation. Hmm. Any thoughts to add to that before we wind down?
It's just what I do for fun. I
Crazy.
sort of define success by how much fun I'm having, by how much, excitement or exuberance I feel about what I'm doing. So it really makes sense for me. And I realize that a lot of people that I coach have a different benchmark for success.
Hmm.
It's just
Hmm.
really important that we all identify how we're defining success so that we can catch ourselves when we're defining success by someone else's behavior.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
got our boss to treat us differently, or we got our colleague to quit doing something, or we were able to make our spouse or our child do something. It's like that's just a very different rubric for success.
Very
Um,
fleeting too.
than being able to say, I'm basing my success on how I feel.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
What's the experience of life that I want? And the hard thing to trust, because we're kind of trained out of this early, is that if I align my life so that I'm creating more and more of the experience and the way of being that is true to me, the rest takes care of itself. We're kind of trained otherwise.
Soak that in. Let
Yeah.
me just soak that in. We say it one more time.
Hmm. The the thing we're trained out of is that if we align ourselves more with the experience that we want to be and that is true to who we are innately, that the rest takes care of itself.
That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's our button.
So
Boop.
good. So good. Ding, 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 ding. The lights go on, the sparks go off.
Yeah, yeah. Amy, what do you want people to know about what you're up to, what you're doing? Where can they find you? You know, anything you want to share along those lines?
Sure. I love to speak. I'm happy to share my message on stages all over the world. I train coaches, and I love really pushing the envelope using co-parent coaching in a domestic law setting. So I work and do a lot of speaking to judges and attorneys all over the US about using co-parent coaching in really high conflict situations. I just really appreciate folks reaching out to me by email or set up a info appointment on my website. And I'm also on LinkedIn and TikTok and Instagram.
What is your website? Is it just your name?
It's actually the Center for Family Resolution.
The Center for Family Reg, and I'm imagining it's CENTER.
It is
Okay,
exactly.
great. We have
Thanks.
some
That's a
Canadian
great
listeners,
catch.
so yeah.
That is a great catch. So the Center for Family Resolution.com.
Uh-huh, beautiful. Yeah, my background prior to this work was law, and the I have a number of friends who got into family law, and I'll tell you, like, that is challenging space. And so for any of you that experience conflict, I really invite you to reach out to Amy and maybe have a different conversation than the one that the legal system offers, because it's
And we link with folks in the legal system. So we're doing this we're
yeah, in
really making a
partnership.
dent in the way domestic courts are seeing the conflict. And I'm just
Amazing.
thrilled for the progress we've made.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. It's I just see time and again, it's a system that by default people go into it thinking I will wrest back my power, and it does quite the opposite. You end up giving away your power, and it's even when you win, you often feel like you lose. So thanks
It's
for doing that
really
work,
defeated.
and super grateful that you're up to that.
Well, I just have met so many amazing people through the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. I really honor the work of the folks that have gone before me and the judges that have invited me in and trusted me to work with their clients. And it's really, I'm having fun, even though I hate to use that word when we're working with people that are at really the darkest point in their life.
Such
But
an
it's
important
very
thing.
engaging work. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I hear you're sharing is that you're expressing, experiencing joy without taking away or diminishing from
Right.
the experience they're going through, and
Exactly. I
that's so
like the
valuable.
complex situation and to see how coaching can really help people find the right next step for them in a very daunting system.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Amy. It's been
Oh,
a real
thank you
treat
for
to,
having me.
yeah, super fun, really cool to sort of one of the things I love about these conversations is finding, I really believe there's no one model, and that, you know, again, like everything, if you go far enough, it all makes sense. It's all
It
connected.
all
So
makes sense.
really rich conversation, and have an amazing weekend.
Thank you. You too. Thank you for all your insights and for hosting an engaging session.
Okay, now we're going to stop
Okay.
this recording. Bye, everyone.